Hi, this is Miss Nelson and welcome to the context for the Prelude, Stealing the Boat by William Wordsworth. All images used in this PowerPoint are of the public domain. We're going to be looking at three key points of information. We're going to be looking at the poet, we're going to be looking at the Romanticism movement, and we're going to be looking at the inspiration for the poem. Now, William Wordsworth was the poet laureate in his time. We know from previous videos this means he's an influential poet who's considered iconic to the time he was living in. He was a natural/nature poet whose poems had a strong connection to the theme of nature, both good and bad, and the impact of nature on mankind. He often wrote in a strong personal voice, as a lot of his poems were based on personal views, and the majority of his poems are lyrical ballads. They're personal poems that tell a story. Wordsworth was known as a lake poet. This was due to his connection and life surrounding the Lake District. A lot of the poems he wrote there detailed stronger and more negative emotions. The Prelude was written about the Lake District. A lot of his later poetry, also written in the Lake District, dealt with sadness, separation and grief. But he's also known for writing happier nature-themed poems with strong natural images. Now, we've mentioned the Romantic poets before in a previous video, but we'll have a look at them again. Wordsworth was considered to be one of the writers and poets at the forefront of the Romanticism movement in Britain. He's very much considered a figurehead for it, so he's seen as the person who brought the Romanticism movement to English literature. As mentioned before, Romantic poets focus a lot on the raw and powerful emotions. They're not often positive emotions. A lot of Romantic poetry dealt with ideas that were negative in tone because these were emotions that weren't represented in art and literature enough. Nature was also a part of the Romantic movement, but it wasn't always used as a positive. Sometimes nature was used to show that humanity's pride in itself could be its downfall. In the Prelude, we can see this image of nature being powerful. In the poem, Wordsworth himself, as a first-person narrator, shows how flawed his pride makes him, and he describes how nature can turn against people who seek to control it, as he had attempted to do with words. Because the Romantic movement dealt with feeling terror and awe in the face of nature, it's actually really easy to see how Wordsworth's reactions to the mountain in the poem of the Prelude presents this. Now, the inspiration for this poem comes from a variety of sources. Firstly, Wordsworth lived in the Lake District. He raised his family there. This place holds a lot of a cultural significance to him as a poet, and this was the inspiration for a lot of his poems. Secondly, Wordsworth's poem, The Prelude, was actually a large poem. The bit you're reading, Stealing the Boat, is only a small section of the actual poem. The full poem is an autobiographical detailing of Wordsworth's life, so this is a section from his life that's actually quite important to him. Thirdly, and this might have been inspired by several deaths in his family, Wordsworth describes a moment in his life where all of life seemed to lose colour and nature started to seem terrifying to him. Now, this could be linked to the death of his stepsister, who lived with himself and his wife near the Lake District, and therefore linked strongly to the poem. Or it could have had connotations to the deaths of his two children. Or it could link to the death of his brother John, which actually prompted him to go back and rewrite sections of his large poem because it affected him that greatly. Okay, what's left? Try to revise these points. For every quote you look at, try to create a sentence that includes one of these points of information. And try to refer your research on these three topics: the poet, William Wordsworth, the Romanticism movement, and poets that write about nature in the anthology. There are quite a few of them. Learn to compare these poems and the poets together. Now that you know this, good luck.